So Dana will be talking today about secret turning points in the suffrage movement. Of course, in 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the granting of the right to women to vote in the United States. So Dana has a lot of projects going in that context, and he'll be talking about women's suffrage as it relates to World War I and to the general context of 1920. Just a quick note for everybody, we are recording this meeting so that it can be shared with the association as a whole. If you don't want to be on video, you're welcome to turn off your video. And I think that's it. Anything else, Dana, you need me to say before you get started?
No, I'll do a little intro before I start the slideshow.
Okay, great. Well, Dana, go ahead and share your screen. And everybody, you'll as soon as Dana shares his screen, that'll show up larger on your screen. If you do have any problems technically, you can ask me in the chat. I'm the WW1HA host, and I'll do my best to help you out. So Dana, why don't you go ahead and share your screen and we'll get started.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Sal, for the introduction. Nice to be here with everybody. When I was asked by Sal if I could talk in August, it was a natural to talk about the suffrage movement because, as Melanie mentioned, 100 years ago this month, women's right to vote was ratified by enough states so that the 19th Amendment became part of the Constitution. That story has two parts, and the reason I said the secret turning points is my focus originally when I gave Melanie the idea for what I want to talk about. I basically had gone through women's role in World War I, and that was part of a project that I did in 2018 where I was invited to a team of people who were going to do a series of banners about America in World War I and basically what all the different aspects that how it changed America. One of those banners was devoted to women in the war and their roles. And that was quite illuminating to me, and I learned a lot at the time, and that was the starting point for me to do this talk today. Those banners, by the way, those 9 by 9 foot banners are still on display in the San Francisco War Memorial Veterans Building. A number of the people here in our Bay Area chapter visited and were able to see them when they were in the lobby, but they are still up on the second floor. And so if anyone wants to go in there and you want a little private tour, you just have to contact me at my email, which I'll give at the end of the talk. I wanted to mention two things about the chat box. One is that there is a PDF up there right now that everyone can download. It is the outline in text form of what I'm going to talk about today. So if you want to keep it as a reference, I also have several important links. For example, if you want to go look at those World War I banners that were created and put on display in 2018, there's a link at the beginning of the PDF that you can click on and go look at them. And at the end, there's a couple of links. There's a list of the suggested reading lists that I have put together with the help of my domestic partner, Anne. And there is also a link to the, they're trying to build this. This is the National Women's Historical Museum website, and I have that. I highly recommend it. A lot of the information I got was there. And then I have my email also in that PDF. So if you want to contact me, I am doing a special 100th anniversary suffrage commemorative project. We're building the website, and there will be a Facebook page. And if you want me to get you on the email notification list so you know that when it is available to go look at, all you have to do is send me an email to my dana.lombardy@gmail.com email address. Anyway, so I decided as I was putting this together that there's going to be two parts to it. The first part is the true but incomplete and slightly slanted story. And I don't mean biased. I mean, it just mostly emphasizes the good news, the successes, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it does leave out a lot of things that were incredibly important. And it's sort of reduces the struggle to everything went our way and then we got the vote and that was it. And that's just not what happened. And there was a lot of not only pushback, but there were a lot of mistakes made as women learned how to do a political movement from scratch when, of course, they had never been allowed to do that, let alone vote. Anyway, so part one is going to be what most people can get on the internet anytime, and you'll be able to look at it. Again, like I said, I'm going to blow through this a little more quickly than normal. There are a few images, but I have the entire text for you to look at. Part two is where I get into the secret turning points and the information that is not as well known. However, but first, let's see if I can, there it is. I'm dedicating this to my daughter. You can see her standing next to me, and in the background are 4 of the 8 banners, the 9-foot square banners that hung in the lobby of the San Francisco War Memorial Veterans Building. That's where they appeared originally, and now they're upstairs. I also want to thank my domestic partner, Ann Merritt. She is standing there in her 1916 suffragette outfit. She is a costumer. She loves doing this, and she's one of the secret turning points for my talk, because she gave me so much information and suggested books and other things that I needed to look at beyond what I already knew about women's roles in World War I. There were a lot of other factors going on. So again, this will go a little bit faster than normal, but if somebody wants me to repeat something later, just go ahead and put it in the chat room, and Melanie can tell me that I need to do that. So the struggle for women's suffrage began 72 years in 1848. The Women's Rights Convention started in, it just went out of my head. That was the Seneca Falls, New York. Thank you. Boy, this is not a good sign. Okay. Anyway, so from 1848, the next 72 years was a real struggle, and there were elements of incredible struggle. I think that some of the timelines just don't emphasize that, but this is a dramatic and amazing social movement that is very important, and I think that I hope that I do it justice in this talk. Elizabeth Cady Stanton presented what was called the Declaration of Sentiments at that convention, and it basically created the agenda of women's activism for all the decades that are going to follow. The Declaration of Sentiments was written in the same style as Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence for the United States. Thomas Jefferson wrote down, the reason we're declaring our independence from Great Britain is that there are 18 points, grievances against George III. Well, Stanton wrote 18 grievances against men that were the reason why women felt like they had to do this. And those grievances obviously included not just not being able to vote, but women couldn't own property. They couldn't make contracts. That was all through their husbands or their fathers. There were a lot of restrictions on women socially, culturally. And this was the first time that someone itemized those and said, we need change. Also in 1815, the women's suffrage movement made a really strong alliance with the Abolitionist Movement. That was also a big movement in the early 1800s up until the American Civil War. One of those ladies who was important to the Abolitionist Movement was Sojourner Truth, and she gave a speech at a suffrage convention in 1851, and she called it "Ain't I a Woman?" showing that women African-American women are equal to white women. Now, Susan B. Anthony joined the movement. She became more famous, but Susan B. Anthony joined the movement and became friends with Stanton. And for the next 50 years, both of them basically organized and lobbied for women's rights. That's why those two are so important and why they are noted on all of these websites, and why Anthony ended up on a dollar coin. And then the suffrage movement just totally slammed to a stop when the Civil War began. And for those 4 years, women supported the war, and the Civil War ended slavery in America. That was a huge change in America, and it was a lot of destruction. In the South and its economic system, which included primarily slavery as one of its main pillars, was destroyed. That economic system and the Confederacy was destroyed by that war. So there were two federal amendments that happened after the Civil War. In 1868, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, which included the former slaves recently freed by the 13th Amendment, but citizens and voters were defined exclusively as males. And then in 1870, 2 years later, the 15th Amendment guaranteed voting rights to African American men, but not women. Women still could not vote. As you can imagine, Anthony and Stanton were really not happy with this. They were very angry that these two amendments were not inclusive of women, and so they refused to support it. They also broke with Frederick Douglass, who was a very famous speaker and African-American who basically was the face of abolitionist movement in the North. He was part of the suffrage movement at that point, but he broke with them when they refused to support the 14th and 15th Amendment. So after 20 years, where was it? They continued to push forward. The more conservative activists formed the American Women's Suffrage Association, and they worked through amending individual state constitutions. There'll be more on that later. So there was now a separate suffrage association from what Stanton and Susan Anthony was doing. Many early suffrage supporters, including Susan B. Anthony, remained single because married women could not own property, as I mentioned earlier, in their own names, and they could not sign legal contracts. Again, you know, once you got married, you were no longer independent or could do any of those things. But also now, after 20 years, there was starting to get some pushback, both men and women. And in 1871, there was an anti-suffrage party. It was founded then as part of the pushback. In 1872, Susan Anthony cast her ballot for Ulysses S. Grant in the presidential election, but she was arrested and brought to trial, and 15 other women were arrested for illegally voting. They were slapped on the wrist and got out. Sojourner Truth appeared at a polling booth in Battle Creek, Michigan, demanding a ballot to vote, but she was just simply turned away. They didn't feel like arresting somebody and basically incarcerating a woman who had been a slave. So that basically passed. But it was a moment of protest that the suffrage movement wanted to make a point. And then in 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded and became an important proponent in the fight for women's suffrage. In other words, temperance, it used to be suffrage and abolitionism. Once the abolitionist movement was no longer needed because the slaves were freed, now it was suffrage movement and the temperance movement, okay? Unfortunately, this was not the wisest political move because one of the strongest opponents to women's enfranchisement was the liquor lobby, which feared women might use their vote to prohibit the sale of liquor. And they were right about that. We'll do more about this in part 2. As you can see, the women are standing out there trying to convince men by singing hymns that they shouldn't drink. For some reason, that didn't work. Okay, so from 1870 to 1920, the progressive era is one of the most important social periods in American history. It incorporated the suffrage movement, but there were many other things going on during that time. And so we can't really talk about the suffrage movement as an isolated bubble. There are a lot of other things going on that women were involved in, that the suffrage movement was involved in, and other people were distracted by because unions were starting to come into existence. I mentioned the temperance movement. There was a huge speaking tour that people, men and women who were good speakers, were involved in, and they'd go for churches around the country. They would go to meeting halls and so forth, and they gave talks on things that were important, whether it was the Grange movement, temperance, pacifism, the unions, suffragists. So there were a lot of things that were going on during this period, not just the suffrage movement. The first time that they tried to propose the amendment on women's suffrage, it would be worded exactly, and finally when it was passed 41 years later after 1878. However, the first time they tried to vote on it in the Senate, it was defeated. And then women from all classes and backgrounds basically entered public life for a lot of reasons, like I said, whether it was the rural women, whether it was the women, excuse me, the women who came over in the immigration from Ireland and other countries. But the bottom line is that the issue of women's suffrage became part of mainstream politics. And the movement, the progressive era movement, really started to coalesce in the 1890s, toward the end of the 19th century. Finally, they sort of mended fences, and both Stanton and Anthony's group and the other organization merged into the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And Stanton was its first president. So they basically kissed and made up. And now the movement decided that we're going to concentrate on securing suffrage at the state level, meaning that we would lobby each state in order to add a woman's suffrage aspect to their constitution or to allow them to vote. And then the American Federation of Labor, one of the first big union groups, declared its support for women's suffrage. And then the progressive era continues. In 1895, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the woman who helped start this whole thing, she then published the Woman's Bible. Unfortunately, after she did that, again, the women's movement broke apart a little bit because the conservative suffragists considered her to be too radical, and she could potentially damage the suffrage campaign by being too radical. I'm not going to talk a lot about the African-American women who were involved in this. They were active. They were trying to do things. There was a National Association of Colored Women's Clubs was founded, and clubs were a big deal in the end of the 19th century. There were hundreds and hundreds of clubs. So in addition to having church groups and church meetings, everyone had to go on Sunday. That was just not acceptable. I mean, you had to be pretty awful person to not go to church on Sunday. So not only did you get information and you had really good speakers at church and in meeting halls, but now you had clubs that were a big part of it. We'll talk about the colored women a little bit more in the second part. And then there was a Women's Trade Union League of New York, was founded in 1903, and basically was middle and working class women dedicated to unionization for women and the women's suffrage. And then in 1910, the Women's Political Union organized the first suffrage parade in New York City. So it had been a long time, but they finally put together a big parade that drew attention to their movement and drew attention to the women and what they wanted. But at the same time, the very next year, the National Association opposed to women's suffrage was organized. Now, who was in it? Well, wealthy, influential women and men, some Catholic clergymen, distillers and brewers, remember them? Urban political machines, and Southern congressmen. Remember the African-American women? Well, the Southerners did not want, they already had to deal with African-American men as voters. They did not want a million more voters in the South who were probably not going to vote for them. More about this in part 2. And then in 1912, the women's suffrage was supported for the first time at the national level by a major political party. Theodore Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate with the Bull Moose Party. And so he endorsed women completely and openly and said he's supporting suffrage. And then New York had another big parade, and they had 20,000 suffrage supporters take part in it. In 1913, Alice Paul enters the scene because she organized a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., and it was the first major suffrage event organized by the National Women's Suffrage Association. Unlike the New York parades, some men watching attacked the protesters. Yes, amazingly, there was alcohol involved, and so some of these drunk men went berserk and went after the women, which was pretty despicable, but Paul was very happy with that because it certainly got the women attention in a way that the men certainly didn't want it to look like they were being attacked and being basically vilified, and violence was being inflicted on women just because they said, we want the vote. So this actually worked well, and the reason for that is that Alice Paul had learned about basically how to protest, how to organize from her time with the Radical Women's Social and Political Union when she was in England and she was working with Mrs. Pankhurst over there. the suffrage movement continued to grow. All this was just building. This was great stuff. In 1914, the National Federation of Women's Clubs, remember I mentioned the clubs, which had over 2 million members, they formally endorsed the suffrage campaign. In 1915, a transcontinental suffrage tour gathered over 500,000 signatures on petitions to Congress. So this is no longer just a small movement. This is a major American movement with millions of women involved in it. 40,000 women marched in the 1915 New York suffrage parade. That's double from 1912. And you may see a lot of women today, and Anne was wearing one in her white dress at the beginning of the talk. White dresses today are associated with the women's movement because these white dresses were a symbol of most of the women who marched in these suffrage parades. And then in 1915, suffragists joined Henry Ford's peace trip to Europe to try and stop World War I. Both of these things we'll talk about a little bit more in part 2. Then in 1916, Jeannette Rankin of Montana was the first woman elected to the House of Representatives. And Woodrow Wilson stated that the Democratic Party platform supported suffrage. That was in 1915. So you can see that they turned, in a political cartoon, they turned Wilson into the Statue of Liberty wearing his banner. And there she is, Rankin, a colorized photo from the period. That's her, first woman in the House of Representatives. So in January of 1917, the National Women's Party picketers appeared in front of the White House. Guess who? Alice Paul, leader of the National Women's Party, was put in solitary confinement in the mental ward of the prison to try and break her will and undermine her credibility. Guess what? It didn't work, and it's going to backfire on Wilson big time. In June, they then started arresting all the women who were standing outside picketing. But then they went on a hunger strike, just like the women in the suffrage movement in Great Britain, and the government looked terrible. It was the worst possible way for them to behave. These women were being starved to death, treated terribly, and in November they were released in response to public outcry. So it certainly got attention. And guess who? Yeah, well, guess who is the one focus on every one of these banners? That's right, Woodrow Wilson. So finally, the suffrage movement succeeds. Yay! In 1918, the suffrage amendment passed the House of Representatives, but it failed to win the required 2/3 majority in the Senate, despite Woodrow Wilson speaking before the Senate in favor of suffrage. However, the year later, the Senate finally passed the 19th Amendment, and the ratification process began. And then through 1919 and into 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures and became an official amendment to the Constitution. American women won their voting rights. Well, most of them did. So that's the story that is out there. That's the story that you can find easily. That's the story that emphasizes the most positive aspects and the big successes of the movement. And like I said, well, I have a different take on this. This is the 19th Amendment story, part 2, which is the missing backstories, and there's several of them. A lot of the people who know me and have heard my previous talks on World War I and other subjects know that I'm a contrarian, as in, contrary to the public narrative, or contrary to the widely accepted view on blah, 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 this just bothered me. There was too many things missing, and I didn't understand why aren't they emphasizing some of these things, and why aren't they answering some of the questions I've got. And the things you're going to see in my second half are things that I found sometimes easily, but a lot of them are not available at all easily. In fact, I had to go through either some books or I had to really dig in an indirect way on the internet. The bottom line is that the women's suffrage movement was more nuanced and more complex than the true but incomplete story that I presented in the first part of this, and that's presented on the internet. So there are 8 sections that I'm going to provide here that basically tell the story or the secret turning points of why it all happened. And the lady you're looking at is Mrs. Cat, and she's going to come in very prominently. She wasn't mentioned in the first part. She is on the internet, but what she did and what she sacrificed and what she had to pay for her support is going to be really interesting. Number one, in 1848, there was no universal male suffrage. That's right. There were millions of men in the United States who could not vote. So when the United States came into existence in 1776, only land-owning men could vote. Now, by 1856, most white men had the right to vote. But in order for men to vote, there were still tax-paying requirements in 5 states until 1860 and in 2 states until the 20th century. Male voting rights were determined by individual states, not by a federal amendment, until the 16th Amendment was ratified in 1870. So the bottom line is the first 22 years of the women's suffrage movement, there was a less visible and today forgotten parallel struggle for universal male suffrage. In other words, when those women stood up and said women deserve the vote, they weren't talking about like all of our males. It's like, no, only the privileged males who can vote, we want to be like them. That's a little bit different, demand. Moving on. Well, I always like to see in detective stories and mystery novels and movies, what do they always say? Follow the money. Okay, you want to really find out what's going on? Well, the one thing I could not find easily or at all was who financed the women's suffrage. I mean, somebody had to. I mean, when France provided key financial support, that made and helped us, America, in its rebellion against England to succeed. You have to have money to fight a war or a political battle. Every uprising, revolution, and social upheaval needs money to start and sustain and ultimately triumph. Now, some widows, like Carrie Chapman Catt, the lady I showed you at the very beginning of this section, inherited their husband's wealth. Alice Paul's wealthy father and her suffragist mother enabled her to travel to England and learn from the suffragist movement there. But the vast majority of women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the 2 women, regarded as ones to start this whole thing, they had no job, no property, and no access to a good paying career. So how do they do this? How do you travel around the country? How do you just spend all your time basically giving speeches and everything? How do you feed yourself? Where do you stay? I mean, there's a lot of things that were not answered and not even touched on in what I looked at for in the suffrage movement online. Number 2, financing a political movement. Again, follow the money. Women's education, access to travel, and ability to spend time on the suffrage movement was made possible by, guess who? Their fathers, their husbands, their brothers, and their sons. Now, this initially meant that upper-class white women of privilege led the suffrage movement. That's right. The men basically were the reason why it could start. Women did the important work of lobbying, writing, speaking, and protesting. Obviously, they did the heavy lifting. This effort continued in spite of opposition and frustrating reverses, and it brought steadily increasing numbers of women into the suffrage movement. Women made it work, but men played a vital, albeit indirect, role in this women's suffrage movement. Many of them shared the women's beliefs and values about suffrage and equality. Some men might have also been motivated by political or financial gain. Boo. The inconvenient truths are men were the primary finance source for women's suffrage until millions of women were paid during World War I, and men voted for women's right to vote. Like male suffrage, these facts about the financing of the suffrage movement really go unremarked today. I was just astonished. These first 2 things, these are 2 of the secret turning points that people need to understand if you're wondering why men didn't just embrace the feminist movement, the suffrage movement immediately, and how it was able to continue. On the one hand, men were trying to get the vote for themselves. On the other hand, men were financing it. So I really recommend very strongly Carrie Brown's Rosie's Mom, a book about World War I's impact on women economically. It's on my PDF as one of the suggested books to read. Moving on. You don't have to read all this, but the bottom line is that the movement did not move from success to success to success. That didn't happen. Everything you see in green was a failure, was a rejection of the women's suffrage movement and the bills and put before the states. And you can see that there were as many failures as there were successes, including the House of Representatives voted in 1915, despite Wilson saying that the Democratic Party supports suffrage movement, it still got voted down in the House of Representatives. So at the state level, at the federal level, guess what? It's not working. So how in the world did the women get the vote? I mean, this is not good. In fact, if you look at 1915, there's a really cool cartoon that shows, political cartoon that shows all the states that up to that point had voted for women's suffrage. They were all in the West. 11 states voted for it, but 36 were needed to ratify an amendment if it's going to work. So here's the bad news. Of that list I showed you, 9 of 12 states needed to successfully oppose the amendment had already voted against suffrage. They only needed 3 more states, and there was never going to be a suffrage amendment to the Constitution. How bad was it? Well, there were 10 additional southern states plus Delaware that were considered hostile to suffrage. And out of that group, only Texas and Tennessee ever voted for the 19th Amendment. So most of them basically were against suffrage from the get-go. So how did they do this? I mean, how did all this opposition come back to slam the suffrage movement? I mean, at that point, technically, the opposition is winning. So many of these defeats were the result of, guess what? Well-financed opposition from, guess who? The liquor lobby and urban political machines. Well, the political machines didn't know if they could control women. They didn't know how they're going to vote. So why would you want all those women voting? Women who opposed suffrage were very few in compared to the number of suffragists, but they had really strong influence. There she is, the president's second wife, Edith Bowling Galt, and she was anti-suffrage. And although this is just a guess on my part, as a proper Southern lady, I believe her influence over Wilson was surely stronger than Alice Paul's personal attack protests outside the White House. So right now, it doesn't look good in 1915 for women's suffrage succeeding. So what happened? The suffrage movement is going to get 2 big boosts. After 67 years, something happens that's totally unrelated to the suffrage movement. And this is from a very recent blog of the Indiana State Library. The very important line here at the end that I have emphasized in boldface is, but on the horizon was an event that would change the course of history and the fortunes of suffragists. World War I. This is huge. How did it do it? There were 2 boosts. Number 1, women supported World War I, and millions of them got paid well for war work, and the government audited to make sure they got that money. Boost number 2 was women boycott the Democrats. I'll explain that in a future section. However, at the beginning of the war, before America got involved, pacifism is strong in this country. Women initially opposed the war. In 1914, when it broke out in Europe, President Wilson said, we are neutral, not going to happen. In 1914, socialists, feminists, labor unions, just about anybody you can think of, including the Women's Peace Party, worked against intervention. U.S. stay out of the war in Europe. In 1915 and 16, women joined Henry Ford's peace trip to Europe. He basically rented a steamship and took a bunch of journalists and women over to Europe, and he was going to convince the people that were at war to stop fighting. That was pretty naive, and the hostility and ridicule of the journalists invited on the trip helped undermine that mission. But American non-intervention sentiment still remained strong, despite the failure of Ford's peace trip. In 1916, Wilson saw the writing on the wall, and he said, I'm running as the peace candidate. That's it. I am not going to say at all, unlike Theodore Roosevelt, who wanted America in that war, he said, I am the peace candidate. We're not getting into the war. However, several months later, after he was elected, Germany had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare against neutral merchant ships, and Wilson decided that war was the only option. So the peace candidate decides we need war. Now, Alice Paul's not happy about this, and she's also unhappy with Wilson personally. So just before Wilson asked Congress to declare war on April 2nd, he met with Alice Paul on January 9th. And Paul's takeaway was to form the silent sentinels who started picketing against Wilson personally in front of the White House the next day. These women protested Wilson's hypocritical stance on the war. Wilson promoted the idea of maintaining democracy abroad, make the world safe for democracy, even though the United States still denied half of its citizens the right to vote. Needless to say, this irritated Wilson no end. Now, here's where Carrie Chapman Cap comes in. Remember, I mentioned her? So after Alice Paul decides to do this, Kat meets with Wilson privately. Now, we don't know what happened. There's no documents, there's no notes. We don't know what happened, but we do know that on February 25th, by a vote of 63 to 18, Kat's organization, suffrage organization, offered its service to the government in the event they should be needed, and so far as we are authorized, we pledge the loyal support of our more than 2 million members. What did that mean? Well, first of all, she's going to pay a price. She is with the Women's Peace Party, and she just committed her group to war, to supporting the war, making bullets, making bombs, helping support the morale of the troops, manufacturing, sending food to the troops. There's no way that her decision jive with basically a pacifist attitude. And guess what happened? They threw her out of the Women's Peace Party, okay? And a lot of the women had hard feelings between her and, you know, their organization and their belief. And basically, Kat had to compromise her principles to achieve this greater goal. What happened? Well, right after this, in 1917, 4 of the states that had previously rejected suffrage reversed their positions and endorsed it. So all of a sudden, 4 states that had voted against suffrage, they said, oh no, we're in favor now. We're going to reward women's patriotism. Now, the only thing I could find on Kat on the internet said, you know, that she's lauded for her pacifism and her goal of world peace, a cause, quote, a cause she pursued throughout her life. I guess they're ignoring 1917 and 1918, which is what got her thrown out of the peace movement. So here's the banner that I helped create that hung in the lobby and now hangs on the 2nd floor of the War Memorial Veterans Building. You can see it's dedicated to the women of World War I and what they did, and they did just about everything you can imagine. You can see at the top, they were the Navy was the first service branch that accepted women and actually recruited them into their service. If you also will note, even if women aren't in the service, look at all the uniforms. Women are wearing uniforms at the YWCA, the Salvation Army, the nurses, obviously, but there are many different organizations. Even the people in the factories were wearing a uniform of types. So everywhere that you went when you were in America or overseas, you saw women doing something for the war effort. So patriotism obviously trumped peace. What did women do in the war? This is off of that. This is a better, easier way to read what I wrote on that banner. Millions of American women struggled with food rationing during the war while working in factories, on farms, and in many traditional male jobs. They replaced men who went into the Army and Navy. Women also served in the military as enlisted personnel, but no woman could serve in combat, with the first being the Navy Yeomanettes in 1916. Thousands of women served overseas. They were hello girls in the YWCA, telephone operators and translators. Educated women usually were taught French, which is why they proved to be really good translators overseas on the telephones and in person. They also served near the front as nurses, ambulance drivers, and Salvation Army donut girls, where they kept the morale up of the men. Hundreds of women were wounded and lost their lives to German artillery fire, bombings, poison gas, and disease. Men saw millions of women in uniform on the whole front and overseas. Women earned men's respect and appreciation for their roles in World War I. And that's what happened. You know, the suffragists finally succeed because they're able to turn around the negativity of 1915 into a huge positive. But there's a political tipping point. In 1918, despite a speech by President Wilson endorsing the 19th Amendment, the Democrat-controlled Senate rejected it. Guess what? For that, Alice Paul decided to boycott the entire Democratic Party, including pro-suffrage Democrats. We went after them all. She made sure these men were put on notice and that she went after them with a vengeance. And guess what? It worked. She was able to help the Republicans take control of both the US Senate and House of Representatives. Now, women couldn't vote, but they certainly had influence over men, and they also were able to show that their role in World War I earned them the right to vote. So in 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed the House of Representatives, again, because it already passed once before, and this time also passed in the Senate. But they needed 36 of 48 states to ratify the amendment. Tennessee was the final chance to ratify the suffrage amendment. They already had 35 states, and Tennessee was the last one most likely to do it. And in August of 1920, 100 years ago this month, it narrowly passed by 2 votes. This is huge. This is a great story. It's incredibly dramatic. Why they're not like yelling this on the internet all over the place, I have no idea. Now, here's the conclusion that I want you to as a takeaway. The women's suffrage movement was a more complex struggle and a closer run success than what is currently presented on the internet. If you don't believe me, the Equal Rights Amendment failed by 1 state. It's still not in effect, and many of the states that had initially voted in favor of the ERA subsequently basically rescinded it. World War I provided a historical turning point and the vital boost needed by the suffrage movement to win enough support from men to pass the 19th Amendment in Congress and get state legislatures to ratify it. And the big thanks here are the women, Kat and Paul, who were able to organize and make this happen. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. And okay, you can see me. Am I in there? What do I have to do?
You're here, Dana. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, so everybody, if you do want to switch your screen back to gallery view, if you want to see, it's an easier way to see everybody. That's usually on the top right hand of the screen. It varies a little bit depending sometimes on
got it. Okay.
Yep.
Oh my goodness, look at that. Wow. Hello, everybody.
So let's open it up for questions. And so you can unmute yourself to ask Dana a question. Just do stay muted if you aren't talking so that we can minimize a background noise. And if you do, I can prompt you to unmute yourself if you're having some trouble.
I have a question.
Yeah.
All right. Dana, there are 2 things that I think should be mentioned. Women were included in the census in every state and in all the nation. So they were, in a sense, represented in Congress, even though it was only exclusively for men. And secondly, PBS has actually had recently a bit of history about the American women's suffrage movement. And I've watched a number of programs, and you've highlighted a number of them. And that's just the only points I wanted to bring out.
Okay, thank you. That you're right. I do want to point out that PBS ran a program that I watched. It was over 2 days, was really excellent, but it left out some important things. It didn't talk about the money situation at all. It never mentioned that basically the white women of the suffrage movement threw the black women under the bus in order for them to get the vote.
Right.
And so there were a lot of things that happened, and there was no mention about the pacifists throwing out Kat because she endorsed the war. She basically became a war supporter. So there were things that were left out that I think are pretty significant and should have been mentioned, and I'm sorry that they chose not to.
Just to comment on the movement in general. I grew up in Rochester, New York, and Seneca Falls is south of there on one of the Finger Lakes. Not much has changed since 1840. It's a pretty town with a college there. The other claim to fame to upstate New York is where Joseph Smith found the tablets there. So we have the Mormons and the suffragette movement.
Wow, an infamous city.
Well, and Kodak was also founded in Rochester.
Dana, I have a
presentation.
Behind me, see the 3 books here? I have the 3 books, and they're on that list. These are the 3 books that are on the reading list, and I recommend them very strongly. Next question?
Well done.
Thank you very much.
A question. Well, first a quick comment. So the image that you showed of the photograph of Sojourner Truth, the current issue of the New York Times, they actually feature a kind of collage based on that photograph.
Oh,
if
nice.
anybody wants to check that out, yeah, and in as part of their commemoration of the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, so they feature Sojourner Truth on the cover. And why all these states in the West had adopted women's suffrage and so many states in the East didn't? What is the reason for that?
Most of the population was in the East or in the Midwest. And so the West was sparsely populated, and they desperately wanted women to move out there. Okay, so that's why I said Montana or Wyoming. Rankin, who became the first representative elected to serve in the House, one of the tempting things that the Western states said is, you can vote. Come on out here. You can vote for anything. In fact, we'll elect you to be mayors, to be, House of Representatives or whatever, because we need women. Please, come on. But back in the East, you had established, really well-organized, long-term political organizations that were just not in favor of this. I mean, alcohol was everywhere. It was not just the people who were brewing beer and distilling whiskey and so forth. It was like a vital part of the economy. And I don't even know, except for a tiny number of men who were temperate, that, I don't even know that there were that many men who didn't want to drink. So aligning themselves with the temperance movement went against what all these men in the East wanted, and against the unions in the East, and basically all the wealth and power of the railroads and the oil barons and everybody else. They didn't see any reason to support suffrage.
Could women always be elected? You had showed the picture of Jeanette Rankin.
Out west. In other words,
Okay.
remember, each state had a choice. They could do things within the state. And in that case, they were able to select a woman by their state constitution who could serve in the House of Representatives, the federal level. They were allowed to do that. So a state could not only have suffrage, but they could even have women elected to serve at the highest level they could, which would either be the Senate or the House. Anybody else?
Just a quick reminder to the people who are non-video, we won't be able to see you. So if you wanted to speak, so if you do want to speak, just unmute yourself and start speaking. I wouldn't be able to see if you were kind of indicating. So just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I have a question. Sorry, I don't have my camera on. I'm a little confused as to, because women, they couldn't vote in federal elections, right? So could women vote for federal representatives from their states, or could they only vote for state representatives within their state?
Again, that's state by state. Technically, in a state that did not recognize any women's suffrage, they couldn't vote at all, period, for anybody, even at the state level. Some states said, sure, women can vote for state representatives, but you can't vote for the federal representatives. And then, like I said, with Rankin and with a few states in the West, they said, sure, you can vote for everybody, but I don't think they allowed women's votes to count for the president, even though they could, like Rankin, get elected to the House. It was very confusing. It was, every state had something a little different. And there was, like I mentioned about men, I mean, if you didn't own property, you couldn't vote at all. But then all of a sudden, okay, now you can vote even if you don't have property. But did you pay taxes? Well, if you didn't pay taxes, you can't vote, et cetera, et cetera. So there's always a reason to reduce the number of voters.
Thank you.
Somebody else had a question. What? Anybody? Okay, well, I'm going to bring up a couple of notes that I have on the PDF that you can download. Remember I mentioned Carrie Chapman, a cat, who was one of the most important women involved in the suffrage movement. Even though she had to go against her principles, the fact that she did that for a political cause was pretty amazing. She is called on the internet and by women's organizations now, she's the organizer of the quote, winning strategy that made suffrage success possible. And keep in mind, when she was doing this in the early 20th century, there were obviously no telephones, there were no computers, there were no television. Telephones did start to come in, but not on a wide basis. And many of the rural areas had no electricity. That all happened because of FDR's plan during the Great Depression. So there were a lot of things that she had to do the old-fashioned way with telegraph, limited telephone, writing, traveling by train places, and keep millions of women organized and aware of what they were doing as a group and basically lobbying on all the state levels, all of these different states. She also said something that I want to mention. She did the founding of the League of Women Voters in 1920. After women got the vote, she wanted to have an organization that would help women make good choices. This is what she believed. I'm just quoting. Cat believed that the political process should be rational and issue-oriented, dominated by citizens, not politicians. Sounds like a great legacy. That's wonderful. But you know what? I'm sorry. Politicians not running things, it's like that was pretty much a fantasy. I'm glad she did the League of Women Voters, but 100 years later, there is no chance that politicians aren't going to determine everything, and we don't have irrational, emotional, and crazy elections. We always have them now, probably always will. That's my political opinion. I won't mention anything else politically because otherwise everyone will want to kill me. Okay. So the other thing is Alice Paul. After 1920, this woman is amazing. I mean, she was more radical. I think that's probably one of the reasons why I think a lot of the women today like her, appreciate her, and they like what she did. But it wasn't just Paul, it was Cat and Paul. And Alice Paul, after the election, she went on to do a lot more. Cat was basically done. Women got the vote, and she then founded the League of Women Voters, which was important. But Alice Paul went on, and her party, the National Women's Party, authored 600 pieces of legislation, and more than 300 of them were passed regarding women's work, women's wages, women's everything you can imagine. And that's still going on today because childcare, being able to get access to medical services, all that stuff is continued today. The organization is no longer as active politically, but today it works on education, and it preserves its collection of firsthand documents, historical documents about the suffrage movement. So I have one last little thing, unless somebody's got a great question for me. How do we remember it? How does everyone know, and they can hold in their hand, what happened? The Susan B. Anthony dollar coin, right? Do you remember that? It ran from 1979 to 81, and guess what? It fell flat. It just wasn't appreciated. I mean, where are all the people supporting suffrage? I mean, they should have all been out there buying these things, but guess what? It was basically withdrawn because the public didn't like it. I think they sabotaged it. That little coin was you know what? That coin was so close to being a quarter in size and shape that a lot of people threw those dollars in a machine, vending machine, thinking they were putting a quarter in there. As a result, that was part of the feedback, the negative feedback about the Susan B. Anthony dollar. It did come back for a while in 1999, but this tells you probably something more than I can say. There's another dollar coin that was formed with a woman on it. Does anyone know who that was?
Sojourner of Truth.
Nope. Sacagawea. Okay.
Oh, Joy,
Who
you're right.
basically was the translator and guide for Lewis and Clark, their expedition up the Mississippi to the Pacific when we bought that huge property from France. And Sacagawea, her coin, which also was a dollar, goes for much higher prices on the secondary market today, whereas Susan B. Anthony, unless it's a really rare coin, it basically goes for $2. So, I want to change that. That's why I'm doing the Suffrage 100th Anniversary Project, the commemorative project. If you are interested in being informed about that when it goes live this month, just send me your email to my email. It's in the PDF that's a download, or you can just send an email to dana.lombardy@gmail.com. That's DANA period LOMBARDY@gmail.com. Any other questions?
I have a couple of points, Dana.
Yes.
Outside saying you gave an excellent and incredibly impressive presentation.
Thank you.
Can't be matched. It was just wonderful in every way. Your research was remarkable. I have a thing, at the same time, Prohibition came in. And that to me is the second half of what of this picture. And many people blame women for having created that, and taking men's right to drink. It's always interesting to me that both of them came in at the same time. And the lasting one is the women keeping the vote. And that, I think, is just fantastic. Now, we're going through some serious voting issues for this coming November 3rd, being, absentee ballots, mail order, et cetera, et cetera. So voting has always been a critical issue in American history, and there's no getting away from it. It seems to be at every election, even local, or whether state or whether federal, these elections are critical in defining us as a people and our democracy. So you've done a great job, and I want to thank you for this excellent one. Now, our next one, and next Saturday, will be on September 12th, and I hope we'll have one. I'm looking for a speaker now for that. So you take care, and thanks billions.
You know what, Sal, I'll just make one last comment because you brought in Prohibition. The Prohibition was the 18th Amendment, and it's the only amendment that was ever repealed in 1933. Right. So it came in 1917 and it was repealed in 1933 because it was the worst idea ever. Okay? All right. Thank you all. I really appreciate it. And I hope you sign up and can get the information about the project I'm working on for this month. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, everyone. Learned so many things that you don't always learn in school, for sure. So as Sal said, the Bay Area chapter will have its next meeting on Saturday, September 12th. We'll be sending out a Zoom link as soon as that is set up. I did send the PDF in the chat and Dana's email as well. If you didn't get those or you need some more information, you can email me, Melanie. I put my email address on the chat, the admin for the WW1HA, or you can give me a call and I can connect you with Dana. All right, thanks so much, Dana. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.